Every AI chat interface has the same fundamental problem. You start a new session and the model knows nothing. You explain your project structure, you explain your architecture conventions, you explain which libraries you use and which ones you avoid. The model gives you good answers, you close the tab, tomorrow you start again from zero. That's not a model problem. That's a memory problem. That's not a model problem. That's a memory problem. And it gets expensive fast. Not just in money, but in time. If you spend 5 minutes re-establishing context every session, and you do 10 sessions a day, that's 50 minutes a day explaining the same thing to a machine that has no reason to forget it. Hermes WebUI solves this. It's an open source, self-hosted agent that persists memory across sessions, learns your project conventions over time, and runs against any model, including the cheapest ones available. Hermes is not a chat interface. That distinction matters. A chat interface sends your message, streams back a response, and forgets everything when you close the window. Hermes is an autonomous agent. It executes tasks, writes skills it can reuse later, and maintains a persistent memory of your environment, your projects, and your preferences. The web UI is a self-hosted frontend for this agent. 3-panel layout, session list on the left, chat in the center, workspace file browser on the right. The backend is Python and Flask. The frontend is vanilla JavaScript, no build step, no node, no webpack. It installs as a Docker container in under 5 minutes. The whole stack is roughly 11,000 lines of code with over 3,000 tests. And critically, it supports every major model provider. OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, DeepSeek, Llama, OpenRouter, custom local endpoints. You pick the model, you pay the provider's rate. Hermes is free. The memory system is what separates Hermes from every other open source UI. When you teach the agent something, your project structure, your naming conventions, how to run your tests, it writes that knowledge to a persistent skill file. Next session, that context is already loaded. You don't explain it again. This is different from pasting a system prompt. A system prompt is static. You maintain it manually. It doesn't learn, and it has a fixed token budget. Hermes writes and updates its own skills as a byproduct of working with you. You ask it to run your Android build, and it fails the first time. You fix the command together. It writes the correct command to memory. The second session, it runs the right command without asking. For Android development specifically, this matters because the number of things you need to explain to a fresh model is high. SDK version, build variant configuration, module structure, Gradle wrapper version, test runner setup, all of that lands in memory once and stays there. The Docker setup is 3 commands. Clone the repository, copy the example environment file, and start the container. Git clone https:/github.com/nesquina/Hermes WebUI cd Hermes WebUI cpps.env docker.commands localhost port 876m, and you have a running Hermes instance. The Bootstrap script alternative does the same thing without Docker. It detects your Hermes agent installation, sets up a Python virtual environment, and opens the browser automatically. The environment variables worth knowing: Hermes Ulsker Boob U I do F fault Ulsker model sets which model loads on startup. Hermes Ulsker Boob UI password enables authentication. Important if you're exposing this outside localhost. Hermes WBUE STUBUE WR controls where sessions are stored on disk, which matters if you're running this on a server and want sessions to survive container restarts. For remote access from a phone or another machine, the recommended path is Tailscale. Set the host to 0.0 WE, set a password, and your Hermes instance is reachable anywhere on your mesh network. Inside the UI, model configuration happens through a profile setup panel. You give a profile a name, select a provider from the drop-down, enter your API key, and optionally set a custom base URL for local endpoints. No config file editing, no server restarts. The model drop-down in the chat composer updates immediately. The supported providers include OpenAI, Anthropic, Google Gemini, DeepSeek, Minimax, OpenRouter, News Research, and local endpoints via Ollama or LM Studio. That last category is important. It means you can point Hermes at a model running entirely on your machine, air-gapped from the internet. The default model is configurable via environment variable and defaults to a small OpenAI model. In practice, you'll want to override this to whatever provider you're actually paying for. The cost tracker in the Composer footer shows token count and estimated cost per session in real time, which makes it easy to see immediately when a model switch saves you money. Here's the number that changes the calculation. Claude Sonnet 4.6 currently costs $3 per million input tokens and $15 per million output tokens. That's the model most developers reach for when they want serious code assistance. DeepSeek 3 costs 27 cents per million input tokens and $1.10 per million output tokens. That's roughly 10 times cheaper on input and 13 times cheaper on output for a model that scores within a few percentage points of Claude on standard coding benchmarks. Gemini 2.0 Flash is currently available on a free tier with a rate limit high enough for individual developer use. For code review, writing tests, and generating boilerplate, all of the tasks where model quality matters least, it costs nothing. Ollama with Qwen 2.5 Coda running locally costs $0 and 0 cents per token, with the obvious constraint that it runs on your hardware and the quality drops on complex architectural tasks. Hermes lets you route different tasks to different providers based on exactly this logic. The workflow that makes sense for Android development in Hermes is not pick one model and use it for everything. It's routing by task complexity. For boilerplate data classes, repository stubs, simple compose layouts, unit test scaffolding, use Gemini Flash or a local Qwen model. These tasks are pattern completion. The model needs to know Kotlin syntax and common Android conventions, not reason about complex trade-offs. Cost on Gemini Flash effectively zero. For architectural tasks, designing a new features domain layer, refactoring a module boundary, evaluating two competing approaches to a concurrency problem, use DeepSeek 3. It handles modern Kotlin correctly, understands clean architecture patterns, and costs a fraction of Claude. A typical architectural design session with DeepSeek runs under 10 cents. For the hardest category, production crash analysis, subtle coroutine bugs, non-obvious lifecycle issues, this is where Claude Sonnet or Opus earns its costs. The quality gap is real on hard reasoning tasks. Use the expensive model only here, and you keep the bill manageable. Here's a concrete example. Open a new Hermes session, select DeepSeek 5.3 from the model dropdown, and ask for a GetUserProfileUseCase in Kotlin, following clean architecture, repository interface, suspend function, sealed result class, error mapping at the boundary. The response is correct. It generates the domain model, the repository interface, the use case with proper error handling, and the view model that collects from a state flow. The architecture is right. The use case sits between the view model and the repository. The domain layer has no Android dependencies. The error types are mapped at the infrastructure boundary. This is not generic code, it's idiomatic Android. The cost tracker at the bottom of the session shows the token count. A session like this, including the full response, runs under 2 cents on DeepSeek. The same prompt on Claude Sonnet runs roughly 15 cents. For a task you run 20 times a day, that difference accumulates quickly. Now close that session, open a new one, type "Remember our project" and send it. If Hermes has written the project context to memory, which it does after you instruct it to, it comes back with a summary of what it knows: your module structure, your dependency injection setup, which Gradle version you're using, which coroutine scope conventions your team follows, without you pasting anything. This is the feature that justifies the setup cost. Most AI-assisted development workflows break down not because the model is bad, but because the context window resets every session. Junior developers on your team paste the wrong architecture diagram. Senior developers forget to mention the constraint that was obvious to them but invisible to the model. Hermes sidesteps this by making memory a first-class feature of the agent, not an afterthought you manage manually. The memory persists to disk, which means it survives container restarts, machine reboots, and model switches. One feature that gets less attention than it deserves: Hermes supports offline scheduling via cron integration. You can instruct the agent to run a task on a schedule and deliver the output to Telegram, Discord, or Slack. The practical use cases for Android development are narrow but real. Nightly dependency audit. Check whether any of your dependencies have published updates and summarize what changed. Pull request summary. Each morning, summarize open PRs and flag anything that's been sitting unreviewed for more than 48 hours. Builds size regression check. Compare the current APK size to the baseline and alert if it crosses a threshold. These are not complicated tasks. They are tasks that developers do manually and inconsistently because automating them requires setting up a CI job, configuring a service, and maintaining credentials. With Hermes, you describe the task in plain language, schedule it with a cron expression, and specify a Telegram bot to deliver the result. The limits are worth stating clearly so you don't set up the wrong expectations. Hermes is not a code editor integration. It doesn't have an IDE plugin. It doesn't have inline autocomplete. It doesn't see your code as you type it. If you want something embedded in Android Studio or VS Code, that's a different category of tool. Cursor, Copilot, or the Claude Code CLI are the right comparison. Hermes is a separate interface you switch to when you need the agent to reason through a problem or execute a multi-step task. The memory system is persistent but not automatic by default. You need to instruct the agent to write something to memory or configure it to do so for specific task types. It does not silently observe and learn without your involvement. And the quality ceiling is the model you give it. Hermes is a host. The intelligence comes from the provider. Here's the bottom line. If your current workflow is opening Claude.ai or ChatGPT, re-explaining your project every session, and paying full Anthropic or OpenAI prices for tasks that a 10 times cheaper model handles correctly, Hermes WebUI changes that equation. The setup is 5 minutes with Docker. The memory system eliminates the daily context re-establishment cost. The multi-provider support lets you route by task complexity: Gemini for boilerplate, DeepSeek for architecture, Claude only for the hard debugging sessions where the quality gap is real. For an Android developer running a typical AI-assisted workflow, switching from Claude only to a tiered model setup through Hermes cuts the monthly API bill by 60 to 80%, with no meaningful quality loss on the tasks where you spend most of your time. The repository is at github.com/nesquena/hermeswebUI. Link in the description. Subscribe for more on AI-assisted development for Android.